in this series called Aging Well, and today is probably not one of those topics that you just want to come up and preach about every Sunday. And so I just want to acknowledge this before we start. Today, the topic matter is kind of heavy, but I hope even in the midst of that you will be hope-filled, maybe answer even some questions that some of you may have, and if not anything, for some of you, give courage to move forward as you walk out of. And titled the message, Grieving, but Still Moving Forward. Because death is hard. And death is an equal opportunity offender. None of us will escape it unless Jesus returns first. In other words, 1 in 1 people die. And when that time comes, will you be ready? I kind of mentioned this last Sunday. Over the last several years, I've preached well over 110 funerals just at this congregation. And in previous congregations, there's been a dozen or more that I've had the opportunity to officiate. And I'll never forget my first funeral. It was for an older, elderly woman, probably late 70s, middle 80s. I'm not sure. It's kind of fuzzy. It's been a while ago. But it was my first funeral. And when I went to preach the funeral, I had to study up because I've never done one. I was like 24 years old at the time. And so I'm like, what do you do when you get to the funeral home? What do you do during the funeral? What do you do after the funeral? What do you do when you get to the graveside? And I felt like I had my homework done. I studied up. I was ready for the message. And 2 minutes before I was to go out to this grieving family, the funeral director came up to me and says, Pastor Jeff, we got a little bit of a problem. I said, okay, what's the problem? Out at the cemetery, they dug up the wrong dirt, the wrong grave. We're not going to be able to bury her. So as soon as you get done with the service, you're going to have to close and have the committal service right here, and then we'll deal with the body later. Thank you very much. I'm like, what in the world? I don't know how that's going to feel really weird. We made it through it, but it's funny because this lady had a lot of firsts with me. Leading up to her funeral, I remember she was my first hospital visit I'd ever done. And so I went, and she had her second leg amputated. And I had been there with her before the surgery. I came back, and she remembered me after surgery, and she's laying there, and I'm just kind of trying to encourage her and talk with her and see how she's doing when a nurse comes in and takes her vitals and does some other things. And no kid you, the nurse, as she begins to walk out of the room, she looks back at me and then looks at my friend Lorraine, and she says, now, Lorraine, don't you run off anywhere. I'll be back. And I'm like, oh, my gosh, right? Lorraine looks up, double amputee, looks at me, looks at the nurse, looks back at me, and she goes, where the expletive am I going to go, right? And I'm like, I don't know how to answer. This is an awkward moment. I prayed for Lorraine, and before I left, she goes, Pastor, I know we just met, but would you be so kind to do me a favor? I said, what do you need? She goes, my neighbor John is he's having open heart surgery. He's in room 212. Would you mind just going by and praying for him? It mean a lot to me. I said, I'd be glad to do that. So I made my way into room 212, and I walked in the door, knocked. Guy looks over, and I say, hey, John, my name's Pastor Jeff. He goes, I said, I know we've not met, and your friend, your neighbor, Lorraine, asked if I would just come and pray with you before you have your open heart surgery. John's trying to communicate, but I guess he can't because he's, I said, John, I promise I won't take long. I just wanted to come encourage you. How about if I pray for you? Let me pray for you right now. And I began to pray for John. After I got done praying, I said, amen. He looks at me and goes, and even during the prayer, just something felt off. And as you look, if you've ever been in the hospital before with the person who's in the bed, and you look over, right past their head is the vitals. It has the doctor, the date they came in, the nurse who's seeing them at the present time. And I looked to see the information about John, except the name wasn't John. I'm like, what? He's like, I'm like, hey, man, I'll be right back. I went out to the nurse's station. I said, is that John? She goes, oh, no. John had surgery last week. He went home. That's Sam, or whatever his name was, right? I'm like, you have a very confused geriatric man that thinks he's about having open heart surgery, and I'm not telling him you can, and I was out. Got out of there as fast as I could, right? Now, here's the truth. John, or whatever that man's name was, right? He too is going to die someday. Every one of us is going to die someday. Some plan their death, some it's accidental, some are die comfortably, some die a painful death. Some, it's eventual, sometimes it's instantaneous. I've officiated many different funerals for elderly, for middle-aged, for teenagers, for infants. I buried all 4 of my grandparents, had the privilege to officiate their funerals and be a part of it. And if I were to go back and we had an hour just to talk about it, man, I've conducted a lot of interesting funerals. I've been around families who just can't get along. Everything's a fight, and it's terrible. I've preached heart-wrenching funerals where there's lots of questions like, why? And families don't have answers. Funerals where the person who is deceased, as far as we know, did not profess faith in following Jesus. I've been in those funerals where the person loved the Lord. I've been in those funerals where it's unknown. And when you walk into those environments, it's like this heavy blanket just covers the room. It's almost like a fog descends and you could just slice it with a knife. I alluded to this last week. I'll give you a little more details this week. It was one teenage kid. He'd only come to our youth group maybe once. His family didn't go to church. He was a middle school kid, but him and his older brother and a few of their friends were reenacting back in the 90s an old stupid human stunts. I won't tell you the show. It was on the MTV. It was a reality show because the show was asinine. There, I gave you a hint. It was dumb stuff that they did. But this kid, they got his mom's minivan, got it up to a high speed, and they were going to jump the railroad tracks that had a bit of a hill to it. They jumped it all right. But when it came down, one of the tires bust, lost control, hit another car. The middle school kid was killed instantly. Mom came to my office and they don't have a home church. Would you do my son's funeral? I'm like, okay. She's got all these questions that I can't answer. I go to the funeral home that day, and as I walk in, I realize the heaviness in the room. At the visitation, there were dozens of teenagers and even adults showed up wearing football jerseys, and then they had these shirts on that said ICP. Now, some of you who lived in the 90s, you may know who this is, Insane Clown Posse. They were known for their horrorcore, hardcore hip-hop music. They'd often refer to themselves or their followers as the guys, the juggalos and the juggalettes. They had like a little hatchet man that ran on their T-shirts. They were united as a family, I guess, through the style of music they listened to. I had never listened to the music. But what really hit me is what happened right before the funeral started. All these teenage kids walked up with 2 liters of Faygo pop, put it on top of the boy in the casket. I'm like, after I was all done, I had to Google this because I don't know, what's the world? So I guess at the concerts, Insane Clown Posse, they would spray Faygo pop on the crowd, and it just kind of took. So this was their way of honoring their friend by being 2 liters of Faygo. When I got up to talk about Jesus that day, I could have cut the room in the fog because death for them, it was final. There was tragedy, but no victory, which is a big difference when I get to preach a funeral where I know that this person loved Jesus, and death isn't tragedy, it's victory. But here's what I know. Over several years of ministry, it doesn't matter what age your loved one dies, grief is hard. In our text today, you're going to see that played out. If you have your Bibles, join me in Genesis chapter 23. We're going to next 3 weeks, we're going to finish off Abraham's story that we started at the beginning of the year. Genesis chapter 23, beginning the first 2 verses, you're going to see that Abraham grieved. Look at this. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and weep over her. We see that Abraham's grief spilled out and it evolved and revolved around the death of a loved one, in particular his spouse, who died at the ripe age of 127, right? And here's what I know. There are occasions and occurrences that can bring about grief that doesn't even have to necessarily be tied to death. Matter of fact, as I've walked this last week with some of you in our congregation, it's been a lot of grief for me, for you. See, grief doesn't always about death. It can be a friend moves away and they move out of state, and the bond that you had, it's just never going to be quite the same. Or maybe it's the end of a relationship. Maybe somebody in the room or watching online, you've experienced a breakup, or maybe you're going through a divorce, or maybe there's this relational rift in the family. Brothers or sisters who used to talk, parents to children who used to talk but no longer do. Maybe it was a diagnosis of a serious illness, or you've seen the decline in one's health, and that you grieve that. Maybe for you it's the loss of a job, a dream job, or maybe right now it's a loss of financial assets that, man, we had all this and it's gone. Or maybe sometimes it ought to be somewhat celebratory, like a child leaving home or one of your children getting married. It's a celebratory day, and yet there's grief involved because it's another chapter in the book of life that has come to a close, even though a new chapter has begun. Maybe it's the loss of something that you've cherished. Maybe you had to sell the family farm. Maybe it was a family pet. Grief can be experienced and expressed in many different occurrences, not just in death. But here's what we also know: grief is a natural part of life and death. Did you catch it in the first two verses, but in particular the first two words? Sarah lived 127 years and then died. Did you catch it? The first two words, Sarah lived. We don't know if Sarah had grown ill and her death was somewhat expected, or perhaps it came on suddenly. It caught Abraham and her by surprise, because even at 127, perhaps she was still very healthy. We don't know. But here's what I do know. There are some of you in this room watching online that you've walked with a loved one. You've walked with a spouse through extended periods, if you will, of time. You've been in and out of the hospitals. You've been in and out of rehab centers. You've been in with them to the nursing home, hoping that they'll return home. You've watched, you've waited, you prayed patiently, hopefully, as you watched your loved one battle for days, weeks, and perhaps some of you even months on end. And as you look back now, it seems like all you can remember is the process of their decline or their dying. The memories of what that loved one, when they once were filled with energy, vitality, and the life that you knew them as, is now blurred. Because the trials of the disease or the illness have made it hard to recall the blessings that have preceded it, and so you grieve. Listen, grieving is a natural part of life and death. I'm going to even say it stronger. Grieving is a necessary part of life and death. It's easy sometimes to focus so intently upon one's death, though, that we miss the opportunity to celebrate the blessings we've enjoyed with their life. I love the first two words, Sarah lived. Laugh and cherish the joy you know and knew. Cry and mourn the loss that you've endured. But grief is a natural part of life and death. And here's the other thing I want to make sure everybody understands. People grieve differently. Some people become angry. Why, God? They get angry at God. They get angry at their loved one. Why? Why did you leave us now? I'll never forget the one phone call I got. It was a good friend of mine. He was like a mentor to me. His wife was our children's director at the church I was working at as a youth pastor. It was an early day. It was my birthday, actually. That's how I'll never forget it. And I got this call, and I'm like, whoa, he doesn't call very often. As our worship pastor called me, and hello? Jeff, are you sitting down? I said, no, I just got up. But you need to sit down. I said, no, Jeff, you need to sit down. I said, man, just tell me what you got to tell me. And he told me that my friend's husband had died, who had been a mentor to me, of a massive heart attack last night. It was one of those heart attacks, you've probably heard them called the Widowmaker. It wouldn't have mattered where he had the heart attack. He could have had it in the emergency room. They couldn't have done anything. It was just, boom, done. And I remember going over to their house, and at the time, his son had married and had moved away, but they still had two young adult daughters that lived in the home with mom. And dad had just started this renovation project in the bathroom. And they meant it jokingly, but yet there's a part like, we're mad at him. He left us this mess. We don't know how to finish this. We don't know how to do this bathroom. And so the anger, like, Dad, how could you do this to us? Joking, but yet somewhat serious, right? See, grief causes us sometimes to be angry at God, and we're angry at the one who died, or maybe even angry at ourselves because there's things that we wished we said that we left unsaid. There are things that we said that we wish we hadn't said, and we still hadn't made that right with the person, and now they're no longer with us. There are some of you who grieve and you have deep regret and guilt. Some of you experience deep periods of depression. There are some of you who, like, I cry and I can't stop crying. There's some of you, I've never cried. I don't cry. Some of you, perhaps, it's still numb from the shock. Reality hasn't fully sunk in yet. And then there are some who have grieved loved ones over an extended illness and lingering death that they've cried along the way that when they actually die, they have no tears left. I want to speak to that person for a second in the room. That doesn't mean you're unfeeling. It doesn't mean that you didn't really love them. But you've been walking in and walking through grief over a long period of time, my friend. You've already grieved because the person that you once knew with all the energy and the vitality, the disease took that away, and so you've grieved this whole time. Cut yourself some slack. And just as people grieve differently, people can be awkward about grief in social settings. There are many people who have good intentions, but they don't know what to say or what sometimes not to say to you when you're hurting, when you're grieving. Over several, 3 decades almost now of ministry totality, I've heard a lot of things. I've heard people come up to people and say, well, I know how you feel. With all due respect, my friend, the truth is, no, you don't know how they feel. But Pastor Jeff, I've experienced the loss of someone too. Yeah, I understand that. I get that. But to say that you know how they feel, everybody's grief is unique. I shouldn't assume I understand exactly what you're feeling or, in particular, how you're feeling it. I've heard people say, we know it's part of God's plan. And I think I know what they're really trying to say in the moment. But let's just be frank, it's not part of God's plan. Death was never a part of God's plan. Death is a result of sin. And that's why God sent his son Jesus to give us life. Because life is always a part of God's plan. Some say, I know it's hard, but you gotta move on. Be careful when you say that to somebody, my friend. I've watched parents grieve the loss of a child. And maybe the dad's dealt with it or mom's dealt with it, but the other one hasn't. And so sometimes when we've dealt with our own emotions, we feel like we've moved on. It's so hard, it's so uncomfortable when somebody hasn't, so we want to drag them along with us, but we all grieve differently. And I want to encourage you that, maybe you've moved on or you're trying to, but the other person in the equation is struggling with this. It's okay to let them struggle. Be with them. You cannot rush grief. And after so many years' experience, here's what I would say to you, should you say something, if you should say anything at all. I would encourage you to talk about that person's loved one to their face. One of my best friend's dad just died the last couple months, 2 months ago or so. And I called him, and we talked for quite a while. I just got to spend some time with him this last week. We got caught up, and I asked him, how you doing, man? With the passing of your father still, how's your mom doing with dad's death? And we talked about that, and he goes, you know what, Jeff, here's what I've learned. We put it out on Facebook, and so many people are so kind. They would say, we're praying for you, we're thinking of you. They'd quote a Bible verse, and he goes, don't get me wrong, that's important, and we appreciate that. But the ones that really mattered, the ones that I made sure I responded to, were the ones that said, I remember when your dad da-da-da-da-da. Or I think of your dad when da-da-da-da-da. Don't avoid talking to somebody about the one who's deceased. Nothing can deepen the pain for the person who's grieving like feeling that their loved one has been forgotten. It is okay. Will you make them cry? Perhaps so. Might you cry? Perhaps so. But it's perfectly okay to go up to somebody who's lost somebody they love, and every now and then, even weeks later, months later, put your arm around them. You know what? I miss so-and-so. I wish we could talk one more time. that ministers to people. It's like the father who shared his thoughts and feelings after burying one of his 3 sons. He said, I was sitting there torn in grief. Someone came and talked to me about God's dealings, of why it happened, the fact that there's hope beyond the grave. He talked constantly, and he told me things that I knew were true, but I was unmoved, except I wish he'd go away. He finally did. And then another came and sat beside me. He didn't talk, didn't ask any leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or more, listened when I said something, answered briefly, prayed simply, and then got up and left. This father writes, I was so moved. I was comforted. I hated to see him go. Grief, you don't simply get over it, my friend. You learn to manage it, to live with it, and to live through it. So don't give up on somebody here today. If you know somebody who's grieving, don't give up on them. Don't pull away because it's uncomfortable for you. Work with them, stay with them through their grief. Be there. Maybe gently pull them, but never push them. I want to get away from the notes for a second, just talk to you heart to heart for a second. After walking with a lot of families and walking through some of my own grief at 53. Can I encourage you that if you've not done so, to gather your family and talk about eternity? Did you hear me? Death is an equal opportunity offender. 1 in 1 person dies. Have you had the conversation with your spouse? Have you had the conversation with your kids, with your grandparents, with your grandkids, with your best friend, with your neighbor about eternity? Is it hard to have the conversation? It absolutely is hard, but my friend, it is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of there is life after this life. And are they ready for that? Maybe you've been waiting. There's no better time than the present. Pray about it. Go with them. Gather the family together. You may be the only one who can speak into that, but somebody needs to speak into it. Somebody needs to have the hard conversation because, my friends, I don't know what other denominations teach, but once you breathe your last, it's done. What you determine about Jesus determines your final destination, where you live forever, in eternity in hell or with heaven with God. Second thing I'll give you is just more personal. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a man say, man, if I could just hear my dad one more time, I wish if I could just have a day with my dad, hear his voice. More if I could just hear my mom say, I love you, son, one more time. You got a great advantage over the generations before us. You know why? Because we got technology. You know what that means? You can pull out your phone and you can tape a conversation. Might be nice if you told them you were taping it. But for example, my parents, I know it's coming. It's like clockwork. On October 2nd, my birthday rolls around. I know a phone call's coming in, and they sing happy birthday to me. I don't know if I've ever told you that. But the one time I knew it was coming, so I got ready, and I taped it. Raph, don't ask him to be on the worship team, just saying. But, just kidding, Mom. I love you, Mom and Dad. I taped it, and I sent it to 3 different email accounts, so I never lose it. God lets me live to be 70, maybe. 70, I still can hear my mom and dad sing happy birthday to me. Take that moment. Have the conversation. Record their voice so you don't lose it over time. I tarry too long. Let me go on. Let me ask you some reflection questions. How do you typically cope with your grief? I imagine Abraham reminiscing over the many memories he made and he shared with his wife, Sarah. I could picture it almost in my mind. Can you imagine the kitchen conversation, the kitchen table conversations they had over the years about what God was doing, what God had promised them? Can you imagine that conversation? I wonder how often Abraham told the story of how he met his wife, Sarah, to their son, Isaac. I wonder if he cried tears of regret as he thought all of the times he put Sarah in harm's way during their marriage. Or I wonder how many times he laughed and smiled through the tears, recalling the angel's visit to declare that he and Sarah would have a child born in their old age. I mean, wow, can you imagine the memories of, wow, imagine the blessings of God? How do you typically cope with your grief? Have you experienced any unexpected questions during your grieving process? Sometimes I've heard people say, Pastor Jeff, I didn't know it was going to hit me like this. And just all of a sudden, yeah, this is unexpected emotions. It's a sight, it's a sound, it's a smell that reminds you of your loved one, and it hits you, and all of a sudden you're in tears, and you're like, well, what's going on? That's why. What's brought you comfort during your times of grief? Abraham grieved. Abraham made burial arrangements. You know, one of the most difficult things to navigate at a loved one's death is their funeral arrangements. So many decisions to be made, questions asking for answers, and often at that moment you're worn, you're tired, you're emotionally spent. So by the way, let me ask you a personal question. Is your state in order? Have you dealt with all your stuff? Have you considered where you'll be buried or where they'll sprinkle your ashes? By the way, just in case I get emails, because usually if this comes up, this is a topic everybody asks about. Pastor Jeff, is it okay to be cremated? I will say this, from my study of the scriptures, I find nowhere where it confirms nor prohibits cremation. Some people will go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 where it talks about when Jesus returns, the dead in Christ will resurrect in their bodily form, and their spirit and soul will gather back to their body, and they'll reunite with the Lord in the sky. A lot of people will quote that, and they're like, well, yeah, we need to take care of the body because that body's going to be resurrected one time. I say, I can understand it if that's what you feel convicted by. But to me, that does not what that means, because really, is it too impossible for God to bring you back into your body again? And here's the other thought I have. What about all the victims in 9/11? What about the infant child who was burned alive in a fire? Are they out of eternity now because, God can't find their body? So if you've ever had the cremation question I'm giving you, Pastor Jeff's, you go search the scripture for yourself. I've seen nowhere where it affirms it, nor do I see where it prohibits it. Now, for us, it's a personal decision. My wife told me, she goes, no, I cannot, even if you want to, I don't want you cremated. I need that finality. I said, yeah, you want to make sure I'm dead. That's why, right? I know what this is about. I can read between the lines. Have you drawn up your will? Do you have your living will in place? Medical directives, advanced directives regarding the medical treatments that you will receive or you will decline depending on your health at the time. I'm telling you right now, parents, grandparents, even young adults, you need to start thinking that through, because one of the hardest things is to watch family, in particular a spouse or their children, have to make a gut-wrenching decision whether they should pull the plug on the ventilator or not. It's a lot easier when you've had the conversation and you have in document form, if something happens to my mother or my father, something happens to Jody or to me, here's what we want you to do. It's already in writing. So my kids can pull that out and say, no, that's what Dad would have wanted. He told us that. So I shouldn't feel any guilt from pulling that plug. Have you shared and discussed your wishes with those closest to you? What do you want said at your funeral? What do you want sung at your funeral? Who will say it? Who will sing it? And I told you last week, right? If I have the privilege to officiate your funeral, man, give me something to work with, right? Give me something that I can talk about you as I talk about Jesus. Now, all these considerations are important, and I believe they can be shared as a statement of our faith. Continue on in the story. Then Abraham, after grieving for Sarah, rose from beside his dead wife, and he went out and he spoke to the Hittites. He said, I'm a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You're a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Now remember, Abraham, he doesn't own any land. He just travels and grazes with his cattle, and then they go off to the next place to set up their tent. He's a Bedouin. So he goes before the people of his community, and he asks them to sell him a piece of property for a burial site for his wife Sarah, and then for the rest of his family someday. Notice again their response, "Sir, you're a mighty prince." In other words, Abraham, you're well known, respected among this community. Choose from among our choicest of tombs. Did you hear what they said? Not one of us would deny you his tomb. In other words, maybe I already bought my plot, but I'll give it to you, man. 3 times, if you read this text, the people of the community offered Abraham a parcel of land to bury his wife for free. But Abraham wasn't about to receive a parcel of land for free. Notice what he says. Then Abraham rose and bowed again before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, "If you're willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." So Abraham says to some of the guys, "Hey, would you go have a conversation with Ephron, intercede for me, and ask him if he'll sell this particular property to me? Tell him I will pay full price." To which the rest of the story says, Ephron, the Hittite, was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Now, at the gate of the city, it's kind of like the town hall. That's where legal transactions, business transactions would take place. So the whole community's there, Abraham's there, Ephron's there, and Ephron says, "No, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that's in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." This is kind of interesting. Why didn't Abraham just ask Ephron himself? He's sitting there. He heard the whole conversation because it's a Middle Eastern thing. It was a sign of respect. You guys go intercede. Ask Ephron if he's willing to sell it. Let me know what he says. Because what if Ephron wanted to say no? In a public setting, all eyes now would be on him, everybody looking, and he would have felt almost compelled, whether he wanted to or not, right? Guilted into, well, I guess I got to sell him his land now. Everybody's looking at me. It's kind of like when our kids were young, and we used to tell our boys, listen, here's the deal. Don't ever come up to us with your friend or your friend's parents with them and ask if you can stay the night and if they can come over and do this stuff, because probably the answer is going to be no, because you put me on the spot. Come have a conversation with me, let me know, and then you get what I'm saying? It's kind of like that. It's a way to save face for everybody, right? So they was going to send people to privately ask Ephron. Ephron would give his response. They'd come back to Abraham and say, yeah, he's willing to, or no, he's not. Everybody saves face in the space. But notice the answer. It's given by Ephron right there in the instant. He says, I'm willing to give you the field and the cave that's within it. I give it to you in the presence of all our people. Bury your dead. His offer appears generous, but Abraham, he is an intelligent and a shrewd businessman. He wanted to pay for and he wanted to own the land. He didn't want it for free. He didn't want to complicate the relationship between him and Ephron. And someday later, somebody in Ephron's family came back to somebody in Abraham's family and said, you know, we gifted that to you, but we want it back now. Abraham wanted to own it and he wanted to do it outright. So again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land and he said to Ephron in their hearing, listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham, you and I are both very, very wealthy men. What is 400 shekels between us, my friend? Again, Abraham was not about to bargain or haggle the price, or was going to receive it for free. He agreed to Ephron's terms and he weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. And afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. And so the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Here's the cool part. This is the first plot of land Abraham ever owned right now. But I want you to notice the detail in the scripture. This transaction that took place is thoroughly spelled out. They didn't have surveyors. And probably didn't have lawyers like we would have today to draw something up. But I want you to notice Abraham paid full price for the land. The price that Ephraim named, he paid it. And he paid the full price in silver that was current with the weight and measures of their day, of that time. In other words, he didn't get no discounted rate. He doesn't want some inflated or diluted amount. Abraham says, no, man, I'm paying prime dollar. He didn't want this held over his head in the future that somehow he finagled or he got some steal of a deal from Ephron. No, he paid full price. Notice, there were witnesses. All the Hittites were there. It was at the gate of the city. And the exact location is noted. Did you catch it? It's in Machpelah, near Mamre. The dimensions of the property, the cave, the field, and the trees in the field. It tells us the boundaries of this land. And then it says it was deeded to Abraham. It's made official. It's a legal transaction. Listen to me, friends. You can walk in faith and take care of business at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. But this transaction, this purchase, is more than just about sentiment or honor or respect for Abraham. Burying his wife was a statement of faith that one day the descendants of his family will possess the land. See, even while experiencing great grief, Abraham makes a statement of faith affirming God's promise. He didn't take, which he could have, he didn't take Sarah all the way back to Ur of the Chaldeans. Remember, that's where he's from. What he's saying here in this text is, this is home. This is the land that our God promised us, and I believe it so. And by the time you read through all the rest of Genesis, my friend, here's what you'll find. Abraham's tomb is full. Not only is Sarah buried there, Abraham will be buried there. So will his son Isaac and Rebekah and Leah, and eventually even Abraham's grandson Jacob. His body will be brought all the way back from Egypt and buried there. Why? Maybe so the family could be together, sure. I think it's because it's a statement of faith. Abraham's descendants were still proclaiming that God would someday give them the land that he had promised. See, Abraham grieved, he made funeral arrangements, and he moved forward. I'm not certain how much time has passed. A lot of scholars think it was 3 years. I don't know. But in Genesis 25, it says this: Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Median, Ishbak, and Shua. The traditional wedding vows often included the phrase, till death do us part. And statistics suggest that men have a tougher time when till death do us part actually comes. Matter of fact, a 2021 study by Pew Research found that men are more likely to remarry after the death of the spouse than a woman. Another study indicated that men experience more negative health outcomes when their wives die than women do when their husbands die. So you say, well, what can we conclude? Well, a man needs a woman more than a woman needs a man. No, that might be it, right? I don't know. After all, God did say, it is not good for a man to be alone. Abraham fulfilled his vow, till death do us part. And now we read that he took another wife. Not only that, but with this wife had 6 more sons through Keturah. I can't imagine beginning a new marriage, let alone having 6 infant and toddlers run around my kneecaps at 140 years of age. Let's wrap this up. What does this text say to us? It is possible to grieve and still move forward. It is possible to move forward even as you're grieving. It's not easy, but you can do it. Because Genesis 23 is still true today. Loved ones die, but the promise of God lives on. And if you're grieving, maybe it's actual literal death or something else that's grieving you today, God will be with you. So my friends, smile, even if through tears. Great is God's faithfulness. As he has been, he forever will be. 2 more reflection questions. Have you been able to move forward through your grief? Why or why not? Can I give you just a couple more things? Don't fixate on your grief. Because when you fix on your grief, here's what you'll find. You'll feel as if you cannot move forward because you're afraid that if you move forward, you do violence to the memory of the one you loved who died, and that's not true. And the second thing I would say to you, from my heart to you, from your pastor's heart to you, fight with everything within you not to withdraw from everybody. Oh, there's some people I know. You don't want them around because they're like that one dude. All they do is talk and tell you everything you know is true. You don't need that right now. But there are some who just want to come and hold you. Say, man, I know you hurt. I'm so sorry for you, what you're going through, but I'm here for you if you need me. Don't withdraw for people like that. It's important to allow yourself and for others to walk with you through the grief. There is hope, my friend. You can grieve and still move forward, and that's my hope for you. May you experience the greatness of God's faithfulness. May morning by morning new mercies you see. May all that you need, God's hand might provide it. Great is his faithfulness. Listen to me. Lord of your life. Amen. Stand with me. I'm going to pray and we're going to sing that chorus. And I pray that today maybe those words would resonate, even though you're going through grief, that can help you move forward. God, in this moment, I pray for all those who are hurting today. I pray for those who are grieving. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one or it's the loss of a relationship. May they know that you're a God who loves them, that you're there for them, and you are faithful. Your faithfulness is so great, God. Smile upon that brother, that sister today. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's sing this old hymn like we mean it today.
Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me.
Come through for you. And I don't know when that'll be for me, and I don't know when that is for you. But as you go from this place today, would you remember his faithfulness to you? And he is a good God, and he loves you, and he wants what's best for you. May you also have many discussions, perhaps this week, with your loved ones, with your family, about life, but also about death. And is there security in knowing Jesus Christ? And do they have that security? You might be the only one that steps to the plate and shares that. I'll be praying for you as you have those conversations. In the meantime, go with God, and he'll go with you. We love you. See you next Sunday.